So today we're going to talk about last 9 months of what we, Olga and myself, are trying to do together. Uh, Olga is an ethnomusicologist living in Paris. She studied music and traditional music at Moscow Conservatoire and did her PhD at Ohio. Um, and she's a specialist in the particular style of music that we have been working on. She did many of the field recordings that we actually work with. Why isn't it letting me? So that's kind of a second title for our talk because it's not going to cover everything about the voice and the difficulties with automatic analysis of the voice, but this is going to show you with examples why it is so difficult, at least in terms of pitch and harmony. Yeah, it is a bit of a long talk. I'm sorry about that. I will try to make it as much entertainment as possible. But here's an outline for you to know where we're going to be. So we first will show you what motivated us to ask the questions we were asking. Then we'll show you examples of our disagreements and confounding issues that we discovered while doing transcriptions. And that led us to basic questions about perception that also question the basis on which the tools we used were built. And from these questions, we tried to formulate some hypotheses, what to do next. And this is where I hope to discuss it with you in more detail. So what we had first, to start off, we had a corpus of traditional recording of singing from Russia. A lot of Russian folk tradition is a cappella singing, and also a lot of it is polyphonic, but there are also solo singing recordings as well. And we were interested in particular in modes and scales used in this tradition. Actually, you would rather say traditions because they are all local and it's a large area, so there is quite a lot of variety there. And in particular, we discovered a phenomenon which we were not aware of before, which we call shimmering modality. I will show you an example of that, which got us thinking. And on the other side of things, we came across work by Pat Savage and lots of other researchers from around the world. Some of them are online now. Peter and Joran Emanuel is one. Our Emanuel is one of them. Our Emanuel Benetos, and they work on human song, human speech, and bird song. And because we found the topics so interesting, but we were looking at how they did their transcriptions and thought, no, that's not the way how you do transcriptions. So we wanted to formalize, why not? This is an example of Russian traditional singing that you're going to hear now, in particular that the phenomenon that we call shimmering modality. We will start, so first thing we will hear the mixed recording of the whole ensemble, 4 singers. This is a song from southern Russia on the border with Ukraine, from the village Plyochova, where Olga spent a lot of her time doing field work. I hope this is going to work. Can you hear it? Yeah, this is the beginning of a song. It's quite a long song there, all like that basically. Lots of you have heard 2 verses of it. There are many more of these. And here you will have an opportunity to listen to each singer separately. Let's try it.
Ой, позари, да позорюшки, да позари, да повотерешне. Ой,
Second singer.
лёле, 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 ле, лёля, ле, лёле, да
Third singer.
позори, да повотерешне, да позуе по вещерней. Ля, ле,
And fourth.
лёле, ля, ле, да, ле, лё, ля, ле, ля.
So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea what they sound like. As you have hopefully heard, uh, the timbres are not blended in Russian traditional singing. So there's no, they're not trying to sound like one, like it would be in a Western choir. And for those of you who have been able to figure out what scale they're singing, very well done. And if you haven't, don't worry. I couldn't either at first. So let's try and listen to it again and try to figure out what that is. What's the best way to do it for me? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Let's start from the beginning. So we start with the lead singer.
Ой, позари, да позорюшки, да позари, да повотерешне.
Da, 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 da. So that is a subscale of the minor scale that she was doing. And now let's see what the second singer does, if the system lets me.
Ой, лёле, 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 ле, лёля, ле, лёле, да па.
Da, 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 da. So that is a whole tone scale or a triton scale. And the point is that they are singing at the same time in two different scales where the tonal center differs by a semitone. And if this doesn't sound odd to you, I can tell you this is extremely difficult to perform. I was given this recording to learn and perform. And because they are not trying to tune themselves to do that. This is just how it kind of comes out. And the strange thing to us was that because both scales are well known in the area, but usually each song is performed in just one of them, and the singers very well know which of the scales is supposed to be sung in a given song. And here they're kind of mixed. So, and they also, we found other examples where they kind of flow seamlessly from one to the other and back. So that also happens. And I was wondering whether this is an outlier, this particular example, or whether this is more common. So we hope to use our corpus of recordings to find that out, to do some mathematical analysis, extract scales and modes, and see whether that happens regularly. Right. So to take into account was that our corpus, though it is not like say for Russian folklorists, it's a large corpus, but this is still not that many recordings. This is quite a common situation with ethnomusicological recordings. You just don't have too many of them. So that is not enough for any kind of deep learning training or any kind of such approach. Also, we had no score notations, nothing like equal temperament. So we were looking possibly at some combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. And particularly, we wanted a consistent and scalable approach, which is replicable, so that we can, we didn't want to be transcribing everything by hand. That was too much for that. One thing I have to stress here, I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but that's always so important. When we talk about transcriptions, be it human transcription or automatic transcription, they are not a truth. They are construction of musical meaning. The transcriber decides what is important to notate and hear and what is not. They decide what is noise and should be emitted. They decide what is which information is kind of commonly known, and it doesn't have to be notated, and that creates lots of meaning universals. I will show you some examples of that. Here, this is a very well-known ethnomusicological example. Here you see 4 transcriptions of the same tune. As you can see, not much resemblance between these. And here is another example, which is a bit closer to home. This is a vocal piece from Bulgaria, and you see 10 transcriptions from 10 experts in Bulgarian singing of the same passage from that piece. And again, not so much resemblance. It might be here, it might be actually a sign that the Western notation is not a very suitable instrument for this kind of annotations. And here we just kind of put together some thoughts about differences between human and machine notation. And the main thing to say here is that human transcription is always subjective, and therefore it is not consistent. There are disagreements between transcribers, and there can be also inconsistencies with one transcriber. So we have no guarantees that the person will transcribe the same recording in the same way. But on the other hand, human transcription creates meaning, as we just said, whereas machine transcription in itself doesn't. It's just numbers that we get out, and we humans make sense of these. So there is no way around for us. Even in automatic, any automatic approach will have to rely somehow on human annotations, which will create meaning out of these numbers. Now I'm going to show you where we ended up, Olga and myself, when we started applying automatic methods to our recordings. We used Pin, you all know that, for pitch extraction. And for those of you who have never seen pitch traces of vocal music, here are some examples for you, just to know what we're dealing with. So the first example is playing Twinkle on my keyboard, and you can see that the pitch traces are very clear. You see where the note begins, where the note ends, and what the value of this note, the pitch of this note is. Then the next picture is me singing the same thing very straightforwardly, and that looks much more messy already. And on the right side, I have 2 examples, the same song, one time sung by myself, and the other example is the actual original, sung by the traditional singer from Western Russia. And you see that in the traditional example, it's very difficult to make out notes as such. We don't know where they start, where they end, and there's a lot of like instability in that pitch trace. And I'll play you that song, the original version of that.
Ой, кумушки, кубитися, кумитися, любитися.
Okay, so next thing we did was to use Joran Six's Tarsus II, which was created exactly with the goal to extract scales from non-Western ethnomusicological recordings. And what you're seeing here are pitch histograms. So basically all the pitch traces that you have seen, they are summed, and the pitches which have been sung a lot, there is a peak, and the pitches that haven't been sung a lot, there is a trough. And in the left upper picture, the twinkle picture, you can see that the peaks are very clear, and they basically show us the scale that has been played. It's very easy to extract the scale from that picture. For me singing the same tune, the picture is much more blurred. It's much less clear what's going on there. For me singing the Russian traditional song, we can kind of still make out peaks, but there are too few for the scale I'm singing. And with a Russian traditional singer, it's just a mess. You can't make out anything there. So that was our first failure. Unfortunately, that didn't work for us. The next thing we tried was semi-automatic transcription using Toni, which is a QML software developed by Matthias Mauch, and other people have been involved in that. Simon as well, who is online. It does three things. Toni is a great tool, and we are absolutely grateful for having it. So first thing Toni does is extract pitch trace as above. Second thing, it automatically segments that pitch trace into notes. And even though Toni is quite good at it, it still doesn't do 100% and probably never will. So it has a great interface to actually for correcting these notes. That was the goal of the software, to allow people like ourselves, transcribers, to correct automatic annotations and to speed up the process of annotation. So that's what we've done here. I've also included a score notation done by Olga for those of you who are readers to get an idea of the song. It is the same song that we've just heard, different verse of it, but it's quite the same. Maybe we should listen to it again, yeah, for you to follow.
Вы будете святировать, сорвите вы мне.
Right, and now I'm going to show you what we found comparing comparing our transcriptions. First thing, unvoiced consonants. When you have an unvoiced consonant at the beginning of a note, say, where does the note start? Does it start before or after this consonant, or somewhere in the middle? That was one of the challenges. Luckily, there are not too many of unvoiced consonants in the pitch trace, because they usually don't have a harmonic component, so they don't the pitch trace doesn't pick them up, but sometimes they are picked up. And here, this picture, you can see, like on the waveform, you can see that there is sound there. And these two are unvoiced consonants. So I chose to ignore them. I must stress here that we were doing our transcriptions with the goal of analyzing pitch structure. So we decided from the beginning that we don't have to be very exact in terms of timing, and we probably, for our task, we can ignore most of the really short segments. Next challenge, voiced glides. There are lots of them. Some are voiced consonants, some are not. And here you can see a comparison between the automatic transcription, my corrections, and Olga's corrections. That's quite a lot to take in, so I will play you the sound so that you can follow and see where we decided differently. First, I will play you the same recording at normal speed, and then I will play you the same thing at slow speed, because sometimes it's just too fast.
Вы будете святировать, сорвите вы мне.
Yeah, it's a shame I don't have a cursor here. Anyway, let's listen to it in slow motion.
Вы будете святировать, сорвите
So again, you can see here that on these glides around the notes, we didn't quite agree, Olga and myself. So question again, where does the note start? Where in this consonant or glide or after or before it is, are we going to put the beginning of the note? And how do we know? I think in Pat's paper, they mentioned something like, unfortunately, the singers vocalize between the notes. This is exactly what you're seeing here. Okay, next challenge, embellishments. Here I have two examples of these, and you can see that Olga and myself, we have transcribed it differently. And the reason for that is that when so she basically, it's one logical unit, it's one syllable that she's singing, but she's doing this embellishment in the middle, which I decided is mode defining. So it basically goes to a different degree of a mode. Therefore, I thought that needs to be notated, given that we want to study the scale. And Olga decided that this is too short and is part of this note and doesn't need to be notated separately. Why I thought that it's important for that to be notated, you could think that short notes don't define the scale and the mode, but that can happen actually, and we don't know when that happens. For example, there's Joran Six's example that I really like about Frère Jacques. You all know that song, like Frère Jacques, schläfst du noch, hörst du nicht die Glocken? Das hörst du nicht. It's a very short note. It's the shortest note in the whole song, but that defines the scale in the sense that that's the only place where this particular degree happens. So if we choose to ignore that short one, then we get a different mode. So
if I could just
yes,
interrupt at this
please.
point.
Yes.
So, I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while. You know, what makes a note as opposed to three different notes, you know, the difference between an ornament and a note. And I guess this is, if you're given the task of transcribing music, you're not told in advance, and you can never really have the same idea as someone else as to what's the threshold. And I just noticed, because me and Pat recently, we did just a few transcriptions as a test, and this was one of the clear differences where in one of the transcriptions, I decided that certain things would be ornaments and best described by an average sort of note, whereas Pat did a more literal transcription. So this is at least something I've definitely seen and imagined.
Yes, and I heard that same descriptions, not just from you, but from other people who did transcriptions. And that's one of my points. Though we only have, at the moment, anecdotal evidence, we are convinced that the examples that we are showing, the challenges that we identified, they are not specific for Russian tradition. You will find them almost anywhere, on almost with almost any examples of singing, and that they are inherent with the process of transcription. So very much agree with that. Where am I? I can't see my mouse. Right. So next example. Sorry. Yeah, how many notes? This is the challenge where I have to think of Emilia Gomez. People who work in music information retrieval will know her. She was one of the pioneers, probably the pioneer of automatic transcription for non-Western traditions. She, when I started my PhD many years ago, she was working on flamenco singing, and she told me exactly the same story. She was working with experts in flamenco, and they would like they couldn't decide how many notes they hear. Like one of them would say it's 3 notes, the other one will say it's 5 notes, and she herself says I just hear 2. So that is kind of a common situation, and that we had this situation as well. This example here, I will play it to you. So Olga decided to keep the automatic segmentation in 2 segments. I did 3 segments. If we start listening to it in slow motion, you probably will hear 3. And that is just to stress then when you start changing the speed, your perception changes. I'll show you. When I transcribed it as 3 segments, I didn't I didn't slow down that because I know this song quite well. And to me, again, this is one of these points, though I hear it as a short segment, I still think it is a mode degree that needs to be notated. That didn't happen to Olga. And the other thing maybe to stress that slowing down is quite a common instrument in transcription, and that again changes our perception and will change the transcription itself. Here another example that I have where you see the automatic segmentation, Olga's and mine are all different. Olga has 2 segments and I have 3. What happens here is that that is quite common actually in Russian traditional music, that they kind of, when they have a syllable with a consonant at the end, they would add like a tiny vowel to that to make it a separate syllable. This is what I heard here, and this is what Olga didn't hear, so she decided differently. And that, again, I will play it to you. So the text is sarivi, sarivi. So it's actually 2 syllables, and that's what Olga notated. And if I play it to you in slow motion, in that case, you can quite clearly hear 3 syllables, but that is not necessarily the case if you hear it at normal speed. So next one, vocalizing on a vowel. Here, what I wanted to show you is that Olga and I, so these are all like melisma on one vowel. There is no phonetic change within these. And Olga and I agree quite well about notating these, and that is different to what Toni automatically produces. So Toni didn't do a good job on these. And I found it striking that while on many previous examples we disagreed, Olga and I disagreed, here we actually agree quite well. So what we did was independent transcription. We had some kind of a protocol at the beginning. We agreed that about the aim of our transcription. And we also agreed what is quite important, that we are not going to turn it into a score notation, because when you start turning these kind of pictures into score notations, many other processes happen. You will have to fit your timings into the multiples of a crotchet and so on. So Olga is a very experienced transcriber, so she kind of tended to do that probably more than me. Yeah, and we kept diaries of our transcriptions. We haven't yet evaluated these because we plan to transcribe more and don't want to influence each other's transcriptions. But that can be done as well. That probably will give better explanations about our disagreements. Here, another challenge, which is very well documented, vocal drift. So when singers sing in absence of a pitch reference, they tend to drift. Their reference tone changes. And here in this example, you can see it very clearly, several verses of the same song going up and up and up. That is very common in Russian tradition. That has also been documented for solo singers, that they tend to drift up. Choirs tend to drift down, whereas in the Russian tradition, they actually also drift up. quite often. We haven't done anything about drift yet, so we need solutions for that. But so far we have just basically chosen to look at the second half of the song, where they usually get much more stable. At the beginning they tend to drift up. Another challenge, wide model pitch classes. So here I have an example of another song. Let me play you this verse.
И упали Лазарю, несли сому землю.
And you can see here Olga's notation shows these notes in the boxes all to be A's, all to be the same. But on the transcription, you can see that they differ quite a lot in terms of frequency, and the range between them is as large as 137 cents. And that is similar for other degrees of the scale. So in some cases, these ranges of different degrees start overlapping. So if you're given a frequency, you can't say for sure which scale this is going to be. So how do we know? How do we know that these like 8 different squiggles of different forms and different average pitches, how do we know that they are all the same degree of a mode? Based on all this, we formulated questions that we thought underlie all these examples that you have just seen. How do we perceptually segment the temporal audio stream in vocal music? How do we know where the note starts and ends? Next question, how do we assign temporal segments to a model pitch class? How do we know that 2 segments are the same model pitch class, the same note, the same A? And what do performers do on their side to control these processes? Here I have an example from a different culture that's not from Russian culture. And what you're seeing here is 25 seconds of singing. It is a music lesson. And what you're seeing are 4 phrases demonstrated by the teacher and then imitated by the student an octave higher. And looking at these pitch trace forms, you can see that the student is quite good. So the forms are quite similar. They're not the same. And here, to zoom in, I have the first phrase for you to look at in more detail. So this is 5.5 seconds of singing. So what you're seeing here is not vibrato. And my question looking at this is, do you see any notes here? Do you see any starts of notes, onsets? Do you see where the notes end? I don't. So for me, when I look at this, I would say that neither the teacher nor the student operate with the concept of note as we are used to doing. And this happens within a high culture with an explicit tradition of teaching and also a music theory. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So I hope you enjoyed it. So we were asking ourselves, what is it we're talking about? What are these segments? So we do segment the audio stream somehow, but how do we do it? We've just seen that the concept of note is not really suitable. We were thinking about gestures, but gestures are bodily movements. They are kind of the unit, the smallest unit in studies of dance, for example, or in an instrumental music, and also in vocal production. But that's exactly the point, because in vocal production, a vocal gesture is a constellation of physiological parts of the vocal apparatus. And that might correspond to the perceptual phenomenon we're looking at, but that might not. We don't know. So we thought gestures should be left with the body. Another thing is a squiggle. You have seen that we looked at pitch traces, where we sometimes can see the segmentation quite clearly, particularly if there are gaps in pitch trace. But in some cases we can't, so that's probably also not a good description. So in the end, we kind of stayed with the word token because it's not connotated in any way, and we would be hugely grateful if you have better descriptions for that. And now looking at these vocal tokens we've just discussed, we were thinking, how are these then assigned to a mode degree? What do we do for that? What do we listen for to do that? So obviously it is done perceptually by the transcriber, but how ambiguous is that? There are several things that come to mind. First, some of them actually help, like vocal generosity effect, which has been measured to be something around 40 cents. So in experiments, at least, not in real life music, it has been shown that when listening to singing, anything below 40 cents is usually perceived as the same pitch. Then obviously this idea of the same mode degree is affected by the segmentation of the stream. For example, the how many notes challenge that I showed you led to the fact that Olga and I ended up with different modes of that song. I had 1 degree more in that scale than she had. Then if we're listening to pitch in particular to decide which segments are the same mode degree and which are not, then we have the challenges of wide overlapping pitch classes and also vocal drift. If we listen to contexts and intervals to the adjacent notes, interval sizes differ depending on, for example, on whether the melody goes up or down. This has been documented very well, for example, by Sundberg. Also, interval intonation depends on speed and the size of the interval, so that is also not an exact science. So what is it we're listening for?
I have a question, Polina.
Yes, please.
Regarding this, the vocal generosity effect. Is it related to just one solo voice, or is this also in a choral context? Multiple voices singing together. Are there any studies on this?
I don't think I've seen any multiple voices. Maybe Peter is the best person to ask.
Yeah, so I mean, the term, as I understand it, was coined by Sean Hutchins in a paper that came out in Music Perception several years ago, which was all solo singing, and it had to do with the perception of accuracy and intonation. So it's related to this issue of whether notes are identical or not, but it was more to the point of if you have a melody that the listener understands as having a correct version or incorrect version, how far off can the pitch be to be incorrect? And one of the main points in that article was that there's more generosity for the vocal timbre than for other timbres. They used violin as a comparison. And it was solo a cappella singing. So I think in a choral context, it could be quite different than in solo a cappella singing.
Okay, thank you.
A great summary, thank you. I absolutely agree. My point, I guess, here is that it probably will not be less than 40 cents in a choral context. It probably might be more. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Let's discuss and find out. So, moving to the next one. Here we're looking at the same thing from the point of view of a performer. What do we do as performers? And one thing that occurred to us that is related to this context is this opposition between what is called vertical and horizontal thinking or relationships. Whereas vertical relationships are based on the rules which govern which sounds can sound together. Even if the sounds don't sound together, still the rules are about what sounds can and how they can sound together. The horizontal view is about the rules that govern which sounds can sound sequentially. So after this sound, what can come next? And in that context, we wanted to add to this another opposition, which we called intoning and prosody, for the lack of better words. Again, any suggestions for better terms will be really welcome. And what we mean here is it is like two sides of the same process. We're not trying to say these are different processes, they're not. But on the one hand, we have the rules, as we've just said, the rules saying which sounds can sound together. On the other hand, we have the rules telling us which sounds can sound one after another. And here we are talking about intoning, where we deliberately produce pitch and tune it to the other pitches, either sounding at the same time or not, or sounding close to this pitch, as opposed to prosody, which is a process from speech, where we are telling something, we're telling a story, we are not intoning or tuning exactly to the other sounds, but we try to create expression. And from my personal experience of working in the Russian traditional singing, I can say that I use this a lot. That's probably different to Western choirs, how they work. But in our case, you have heard that the musical material the structure is very simple. It's usually lots of verses which are the same. So if you start singing them like as they're written in scores, this will be extremely repetitive and very boring. But that never happens to the traditional singers. I don't know if you remember that first example that I showed you with 4 singers. None of them has anything similar to the others, and they that's exactly what happens. So they manage to sing these very long songs differently every time, and that variation comes from prosody. Partly, that's not the only ingredient, but one of them is speaking. So we speak a lot before we start singing. You can say yes.
Can I think of this sort of your concept of prosody in a melody as like intentional sort of variation in the melody line that is not meant to be harmonizing with other people? I mean, I think of it as like putting your own sort of expressiveness into your like a melody line that's otherwise symbolic.
Possibly. I don't know if I can well, you probably can think about it like this. I don't think, say, traditional singers or people who sing in traditions where this is common, that they very consciously doing that. That's just how they express themselves. For us, say, Western listeners, if we try to sing in a tradition which relies more on prosody than on tuning and intoning, we have to consciously learn that.
I don't quite fully understand what you mean, I guess, by prosody in this sense.
If you think about these Indian singers that you've just seen, like, you know, even let's say we know what they were meaning in terms of their tuning. Yeah, actually, the teacher, the father, he was very clear.
Yeah.
But everything else that happens there, what is that? Where does it come from? He doesn't tune the rest. He just kind of draws it. Yeah, I don't know.
It's extremely expressive. I've thought about this before when listening to this sort of music, of when you try and think of examples that in music that do not conform to Western ideas of fixed pitches, like this sort of Hindustani Indian music is a really, really good counterexample where you know, it the way they move their hands up and down, you know, it's very much that they're intending, it seems, to have something that is not a fixed pitch whatsoever, and it's about that control of I guess this is what you mean by prosody, which is kind of difficult for me to put into words.
I absolutely agree. I mean, this is all extremely speculation that I'm talking about here. We're just kind of also we're thinking, what could that be? So please do criticize or suggest other things. This is by no means set in stone. That were just our thoughts, where we can look. In terms of gestures, hand gestures in particular, I would be a bit more cautious here because I don't know, in Russian traditions, you see lots of differences in local traditions. In some of them, there are lots of hand movements, and others there are none. So this is probably a different element that you can add to that, but I don't think it's causing anything.
If I might
yeah,
interject,
but
in the
yes,
chat, I
please.
put a link to a chapter on musical prosody that Palmer and Hutchins published back some years ago. It's I think, John, it's similar to what you were speculating about a while ago, but it's very important to note that this is a paper that's very much from a kind of a Western notated tonal music perspective. And so we are in really different territory now with music where there's an unknown notation that we're trying to extract. And I think, you know, and getting into cross culture. So I think it's very, so there is a way people have tried to define prosody before. I don't think anyone needs to be tied to it because, you know, it's kind of co-opting this idea from linguistics, adapting it to music, and here in a cross-cultural perspective, it's very different. And I also want to apologize because I have to go to another 11 o'clock meeting, which is going to be a lot less interesting than this one. And I'm sorry I have to go. This has been great. Polina, I'll send, and Olga, I'll send some other thoughts as they come to me offline. And if you were able to distribute these slides or any of the rest of this talk at a later point in time, I'd love to see.
You will have the slides, yeah.
All right, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. We'll get back to you on that. Thank you. Right, and I'll just continue. We are close, actually. There's not that much left, if the system lets me. So we, based on all these thoughts, we kind of formulated hypothesis. Looking at the two sides, on the one hand, on the perceptual side, there are two aspects of that process. One is temporal segmentation of the audio stream. The other one is the model of the tonality, which is constructed, and then based on that, the segments are assigned to a model pitch class. And on the other side, from the view of the performers, we have kind of these two aspects again, one which is intoning or tuning, and the other one is prosoding. The same thing in more words, basically, how do listeners structure vocal pitches? We think that there are these two aspects as we've just mentioned, and we think that possibly segmentation is primary, relying first on, say, gaps in pitch traces and also on phonetic changes or pitch jumps. But then very quickly a model, a tonal model is constructed, and then everything else that happens in the stream is rather the expectations according to this model are confirmed or they are refuted, and then the model is possibly modified. And then this model of tonality influences the segmentation that happens of the stream. So there is this mutual influence between the two sides of the process. And the outcomes of that can, of course, differ between listeners and be inconsistent within one listener. And from the side of the performers, again, we see these two possible aspects, the intoning and the prosoding. there is possibly some correspondence to the harmonic and melodic relationships, but we don't know whether that's the same thing. Possibly not quite. And intoning is oriented towards defined pitch classes and tonal models, whereas prosoding is not. And singing styles will differ in the amount of the two aspects of the process. And I think that is actually possibly more than just the amount. There is some more complicated interplay between the two sides. For the people working on the automatic methods, how this affects the automatic transcription. First thing, pitch tracking, we think, was the only reliable stage of the automatic transcription that we faced. And node segmentation algorithms will probably work well for singing styles with a large tuning or intoning component, and will probably fail on the prosodic aspect. Adding phonetic information, we have recently tried it with Yukon, for example, that helps, but only partly. And we think that it would be great to have new approaches to formalizing the prosodic aspect. And if we can somehow kind of separate the two things, if we can extract the bits of the stream where the tuning happens and the bits of the stream where the prosoding happens, then that will really help, because the tuned bits we can transcribe very well, and we probably will not be doing well for the other bits anyway. Right. And in terms of next steps, one thing that we were looking at this idea of some kind of reduction of the pitch trace to extract the tuned moments and leave aside the non-tuned moments. And what we looked at was, thank you, Sebastian Rosenzweig. He gave us his code that he used for Georgian traditional singing. And these are the examples that you see here. So on the left, it is a bit of a Georgian song. And the task was basically to get rid of the glides that you see. And the method achieves it very well. So if you compare the red and the black pictures, you can see that on the black picture, there are almost no glides, and we can quite clearly see the notes, which are very stable and well tuned. If we do the same thing for the Russian example, that first song that we heard, this is what happens on the right side. This is not really not any kind of research. We just we didn't change any parameters. We just did the same thing here, and you can see that it kind of does get rid of the glides, and something remains there which kind of resembles the contour of the song. Is it useful? Possibly. We don't quite know. So that's again one of these practical approaches where we don't actually answer the underlying question. We're just trying as engineers to do something and hope that it will work. Here, the same thing I've done for the recording of the Indian boy that you've heard before. There are two algorithms provided by Sebastian, and particularly in the second one, you can see that in the black example, the boy is gone. There is almost no boy in that. We see some remainders of the teacher singing, but the boy is kind of not there anymore. So this is an example how this approach is not useful, which doesn't mean that we can tune the parameters and make it work. But again, we don't know why that works or why it doesn't work. Here a list of steps we thought could be the next, could be kind of the continuation of this research. We thought it would be useful to look at the same things in other cultures and to classify the challenges similar to the way we did, just to ensure that these challenges generalize to other cultures, that we are not talking about something culture specific. And also to make sure, because I'm sure we haven't listed everything. For example, we didn't even touch things like overtones. Then it would be really interesting to study disagreements between transcribers on a larger scale, particularly in the context of where these disagreements happen. So what we don't yet quite know, or actually don't know at all, I would say, is that whether these disagreements are kind of randomly distributed across the music or whether they are concentrated in particular bits. And if that is the case, there was one paper we have seen by the Ukrainian researcher Anastasia Mazurenko, where she did this for a transcription of Ukrainian singing. And in her results, the disagreements were all concentrated in the bits which were kind of deviated more from the equal temperament. Anyway, if we can demonstrate on a larger scale that there is a tendency for transcribers to disagree in particular bits, and there are other parts of music where they would agree, that will certainly change the way we evaluate automatic transcription as well. Also, that probably will be useful to look at the speech community and borrow ideas about how they study prosody and see whether that is applicable in any way to singing. Otherwise, the speech methods tend not to work well for singing, as we know. In continuation of that example of Sebastian's code, to investigate approaches to reduction and maybe try to understand whether there is actually, whether we can separate the aspects of tuning and prosoding in any way. And it's me done.